HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents Prophets Without Honor, the 2000 Camp David Summit, and the End of the Two-State Solution, by Shlomo Ben-Ami, read by David Colacci. Publisher's Note: in this audio edition you will hear references to visual elements present in the print and e-book formats of the book. A note on vocabulary. Conflicts and peace processes tend to have their own particular vocabulary. Religion was central to the Northern Ireland conflict and to the India-Pakistan dispute, but was entirely absent from the Colombian armed conflict, or from the drama of South Africa's apartheid, the civil wars in Central America, and the Morocco-Southern Sahara conflict. Power sharing was the key to the solution of the Northern Ireland situation, but is entirely irrelevant in the case of Palestine and Colombia. In none of these conflicts, except in the cases of Morocco and India-Pakistan, has territory, annexation, and the delineation of borders played any role whatsoever. The vocabulary of the Israeli-Palestinian drama and the attempts to solve it are overwhelmingly pervaded with the yearning of return of Palestinian refugees, with claims over holy shrines, with Israel's affirmation of its right to keep her settlements in occupied lands and her needs for security. The ultimate purpose of the peace process is the creation of a Palestinian state, the definition of its borders, and the amount of territory it would allow Israel to annex in exchange for Israeli swapped territory for the purpose of accommodating its settlement blocks. The interim agreement that was signed between Yitzhak Rabin and Palestinian Liberation Organization, PLO, Chairman Yasser Arafat, on September 28, 1995, required that Israel offer the Palestinians, ahead of the negotiations on the final settlement, parts of the West Bank and redeploy accordingly its military forces. These withdrawals redeployments were to be defined in terms of percentages of the total surface of the West Bank. Percentages were also to be traded in the final peace agreement, for it was understood that a solution to the problem of settlements would require it. In the first stage of the interim agreement, the Israeli Defense Forces, IDF, withdrew from the populated areas of the West Bank, that is, 6 cities, Jenin, Nablus, Tulkarem, Qalqilia, Ramallah, and Bethlehem, and 450 towns and villages. With the end of this redeployment, hardly any Israeli military presence remained in Palestinian population centers. The agreement also provided that additional redeployments would take place at 6-month intervals, so that by the completion of the redeployment phases, Palestinian jurisdiction will cover West Bank territory except for the areas where jurisdiction is to be determined under the final status negotiations. In his Wye River Agreement with Arafat in October 1998, Benjamin Netanyahu, who had earlier redeployed from the city of Hebron, pledged handing over to the Palestinians 13% of the West Bank, but his right-wing government could not stomach such a sellout of biblical lands, and it turned down the agreement. It was left to us, the Barak government, to deliver on the Wye River redeployment if we wanted to proceed toward a final peace settlement in strict observance of the interim agreement framework. But Barak's idea was to skip the whole redeployment process by moving directly to negotiations on the final settlement. Barak's leap into the endgame was a transparent attempt to eschew the pattern of interim agreements where Israel relinquished territory at such a prohibitive political price that it could bring about the collapse of the government, as indeed was the case with Netanyahu's, and the end of the peace process. Knowing that we would need every drop of public and political support for the difficult concessions required by the endgame, Barak thought it politically advisable to integrate all redeployments into the final settlement. But Arafat needed signals of Barak's seriousness as a peacemaker, and on September 4, 1999, an agreement was signed at Sharm el-Sheikh, dividing Netanyahu's unaccomplished redeployment into 3 phases, September 5th, November 15th, and January 20th, 2000. This would have left Israel in control of 59% of the West Bank ahead of the negotiations for a final peace. It was also agreed that Israel would release a total of 350 Palestinian prisoners. Barak complied with the first stage on September 5th and also released the first group of prisoners. Also, the safe passage connecting Gaza with the West Bank, which I negotiated with Palestinian Minister of Civil Affairs Jamil Tarifi, was signed in Jerusalem on October 5th to Arafat's satisfaction. He even hailed it for creating a geographic and demographic unity between Gaza and the West Bank. Tarifi saw it as an important trust-building move between the two peoples and the two leaders. Droves of Palestinians making use of the safe passage and the start of the construction of a seaport in Gaza went in the same promising direction. But Arafat's expectations would soon clash with Barak's constraints. Pressured by his focus on the peace talks he had started with Syria and ever-present domestic concerns, Barak went back on his pledge of a further release of prisoners and also skipped altogether the third phase of the promised redeployment that was scheduled for January 20th. To stave off the inevitable crisis of confidence, he gave in to Arafat's demand for compensation in the form of a transfer to the Palestinians of 3 Arab villages on the outskirts of Jerusalem, Abu Dis, Azariah, and El Ram, as part of the remaining 6.1% redeployment. On March 20th, however, Barak executed the final withdrawal, but avoided including in it the promised villages. He also released only 15 prisoners instead of the more than 100 that were requested. Clearly inadequate, Barak's gestures were part of a maintenance task to allow him to focus on his Syria negotiations. There is no other way to define also the peace talks with the Palestinians he entrusted to Ambassador Oded Eran, a brilliant diplomat who served as Israel's ambassador in Jordan, to conduct. These were held on March 21st and April 7th in Bolling Air Force Base near Washington, D.C., and on May 4th in the Israeli southern resort of Eilat. The Palestinian negotiator Saeb Erekat rightly defined the meetings as being more brainstorming sessions than real negotiations. In practical terms, Eran offered a Palestinian state on 66% of the West Bank, with 20% to be annexed by Israel, and another 14% to be kept for an indefinite period of time for security purposes. It was a humiliating non-starter no Palestinian could have taken seriously. If Barak's ambition for an era of peace with the Palestinians was to have any realistic prospects, we needed to do better. Introduction. No Zionist panegyric can convincingly blur the responsibility of the Jews returned to their ancestral homeland for the Palestinian tragedy of disinheritance and exile. Yet the enduring clash between Zion and Palestine is not a tale of absolute righteousness. Partisan accounts are bound to pervert the complex truth of a story that started when a decimated people, resolute as only a nation desperately grasping for life can be, clashed with a fragmented indigenous Arab community. It later evolved into a tragedy of discrepant historical rhythms where peace overtures aimed at splitting the land were defeated in order to be missed when history had already swept them into oblivion. Ill-conceived perceptions of the other, all-or-nothing theological fanaticism, and a lack of bold, enlightened leadership combined to turn the conflict into a cruel lesson about the inherent amorality of history. Not in vain has the enthralling drama of the clash between Zion and Palestine been one of the most emotionally engaging causes for the Western mind. It is an absorbing odyssey of two nations to the same landscapes, a story of mutually exclusive claims on sacred lands and religious shrines that are central in the lives of millions around the world. Israel-Palestine is a story far bigger than the current conflict. It is also the story of an extraordinary symbiosis between Jewish heritage and Western civilization that ended in a cataclysmic tragedy. The plight of the Palestinians, the victims of Israel's resurgence, rightly touches on another neuralgic center in the Western mind. Consequently, Israel's suppression of Palestine resonates in a way that no other conflict does. From London to Rome, from Antwerp to Berlin, and from Istanbul to Casablanca, Israel is frequently denounced as a terror state. 75 years after the annihilation of European Jewry in the Holocaust, and shocked by the burning of synagogues in France and Germany, Jews throughout Europe see again the shadow of Kristallnacht looming over their communities, with angry pro-Palestinian demonstrators inviting them back to the gas. Israel apologists are these days facing pro-Palestinian activism on Western campuses, the kind of which is unparalleled since the Vietnam War. The apparent demise of the two-state solution has also made legitimate among Americans the idea of a one-state solution, where Palestinians should have equal rights in all and every aspect. A Brookings Institution poll in August 2021 found that 84% of Democrats and 60% of Republicans favor a single democratic state with Arabs and Jews as equal. Israel's critics would scornfully repudiate her claim that the Palestinian national movement has 4 times in its history rejected offers of statehood, in 1937, 1947, 2000, and 2008. To this day, it is still normal in the anti-Zionist left to dismiss peace offers, such as the Clinton peace parameters and the Ehud Olmert-Annapolis peace deal, both proposing a Palestinian state over practically 100% of the occupied territories, as nothing but a crippled Palestinian state in isolated Bantustans. Gullibility is a weakness that even supposedly educated authors can sometimes share with the anonymous masses. Robert Fisk, who found room in his 1,336-page book to pervert the truth of what was offered at the Camp David summit, he insists on only 64% of the occupied West Bank for a Palestinian state, it actually was 92%, could not find room for even mentioning the Clinton parameters that offered 97%, as if they never existed. I sadly believe that those offers will go down in history as the last chance we had for a negotiated solution to the plight of the Palestinians. Spread practically among all the relevant stakeholders, the inglorious task of preventing the creation of a Palestinian state was not an exclusive Israeli responsibility. In their rejection of the 1947 UN Resolution 181 partitioning Palestine into a Jewish and an Arab state, the Palestinians opted for high stakes with inadequate resources. The war they started on the very morrow of the UN vote ended with what would become engraved in their memory as the Nakba, the disaster of dispossession and exile. By intervening in the 1948 war, the Arab states did not seek to secure for the Palestinians their promised state. Rather, they sought to kill the partition plan and acquire new territory for themselves. Palestinian blunders and an unholy alliance of Arab states, American mediators, and Zionists have been jointly responsible for making Palestinian statehood a historical impossibility. But the war whose consequences still reverberate to this day is the 1967 Six-Day War. Israel's lightning victory brought her military grandeur and moral decay. The nationalist religious intoxication that followed the conquest of Jerusalem and the biblical lands of Judea and Samaria, the Palestinian West Bank, reached dangerous heights, to the degree that this mother of all victories was now being interpreted as a messianic providential event. The 1967 Annus Mirabilis threw the Jewish state into the realm of the fantasy of Greater Eretz Israel. The new zeitgeist gave popular legitimacy to the irresistible bacchanalia of nationalist ardor. "We have returned to our holiest shrines in order not to part from them ever again," affirmed then Defense Minister Moshe Dayan. For a while it looked as if reality could convincingly intrude into ideological purity. It was an Egyptian president, Anwar Sadat, who, in his peace negotiations with Israel at Camp David in September 1978, forced a hawkish Israeli prime minister, Menachem Begin, to endorse such concepts as a recognition of the legitimate rights of the Palestinian people and their just requirements, and the resolution of the Palestinian problem in all its aspects. The text was indeed promising, but not so much the political will to make it true. For all practical purposes, Anwar Sadat signed a separate peace with Israel while paying verbal tribute to the Palestinian cause. "Sadat does not give a shit about the West Bank," confided Jimmy Carter to his Middle East advisor William Quandt. The most that Begin was willing to offer the Palestinians was a bizarre autonomy plan that drew its inspiration from the Habsburg polyglot empire and from his mentor Zeev Jabotinsky, who had advocated the principle of individual rights for the Arabs, but no collective entitlement to a territory. Yet Sadat did revolutionize the entire geostrategic structure of the Middle East by indicating to Arab leaders that only by extricating themselves from the Soviet Union's grip and embracing instead the U.S.-led peace diplomacy could they get back their territories. This was also true of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, PLO. From the early 1970s, it started a process of change that would eventually lead its legendary leader, Chairman Yasser Arafat, to embrace in the November 1988 Algiers Declaration the two-state solution. But Israel's infatuation with the conquered Palestinian lands was such that it preferred to discard any diplomatic approach. It was more politically convenient to fight the PLO as a terrorist organization. This was fine so long as Cold War bipolarity condemned the conflict to oscillate between paralysis and war. But with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the opportunities started to overshadow the risks. This was ceremoniously reflected in the October 1991 Madrid Peace Conference under the co-chairmanship of U.S. President George H. Bush and Russia's Mikhail Gorbachev. For the first time in the history of the century-old Israeli-Arab conflict, the parties and the major international stakeholders launched a concerted effort for a comprehensive solution to the conflict. It took, however, a change of government in Israel from Yitzhak Shamir's Likud to a transformed Laborite, Yitzhak Rabin, to reach in 1993 the historic Oslo Accord between Israel and the PLO. Oslo was an interim agreement that allowed the creation of a Palestinian autonomy in Gaza and parts of the West Bank, and established a roadmap for negotiations of the core issues of the conflict: Jerusalem, Palestinian refugees, Israeli settlements, and Palestinian statehood. Alas, Oslo was designed to function under sterile laboratory conditions, for it assumed that trust could be built between the occupied and the land-hungry occupier. Oslo lacked monitoring mechanisms of compliance and agreed sanctions for breaking pledges. Its architects assumed as a given the goodwill of the parties and their commitment to march together hand in hand to the final settlement on the most divisive issues imaginable. Rabin also expected Arafat to be the subcontractor of Israel's security by putting an end to the first intifada in the occupied territories that had been going on unabated since 1987. But Arafat was incapable of delivering. He rightly gathered that clamping down on the Islamist radicals from Hamas and Islamic Jihad would portray him in the eyes of his people as a collaborator of the Israelis. Israel could do little to help him, for Yitzhak Rabin was trapped in his unsustainable double-edged approach of fighting terrorism as if there were no peace process, and pursuing the peace process as if there was no terrorism. A fatal, vicious cycle was created whereby the Palestinians were hit by collective punishment, economic decline, and the expansion of settlements, whose population increased under Rabin's government by 48% in the West Bank and 62% in the Gaza Strip. Rather than as a modern state bound by international law, Israel behaved in the territories as possessed by an irresistible agrarian hunger. When Rabin was assassinated by a Jewish fanatic as a traitor who sold out Eretz Israel, He was already severely crippled politically by a series of devastating suicide terrorist attacks. Benjamin Netanyahu's premiership gave the coup de grace to an already moribund peace process. Ehud Barak, a highly decorated former IDF chief of general staff and now head of the Labor Party, defeated Netanyahu in May 1999 to become Israel's new prime minister. A hybrid of right-wing sentiments and left-wing political persuasions, Barak cultivated his self-image as Rabin's successor, a general turned statesman. He lost no time in spelling out his intention of reaching a peace settlement with Syria and the Palestinians, as well as pulling out from southern Lebanon in line with UN Security Council Resolution 425. Historic breakthroughs do not occur in a vacuum. They demand a rare synergy between ripe social and strategic conditions and a leadership capable of leveraging the new circumstances and rallying the nation behind its vision. By the end of the millennium, Barak still believed that the window of opportunity of Rabin's times, although narrower, was yet open, and he was determined to pursue Rabin's peace legacy before a brutal wave of Islamic fundamentalism could topple the region's pro-Western regimes, and before fundamentalist Hamas could gain control of Palestinian society and dispel any chance of an agreement. Arafat, with all his weaknesses, was the last obstacle in Hamas's snowballing path. We were acting against the drifting sands of time, for Iran, too, was rising to the level of a regional superpower, spreading its patronage over a swelling fundamentalist wave. As we were briefed immediately upon assuming power, Iran was making progress in her nuclear program. The rising Shiite empire had a strategic interest in blocking the chances of an Israeli-Arab rapprochement. These were also the last 18 months of Bill Clinton's presidency, and it made much sense to have him and his peace team, supposedly the group of foreign officials most proficient in the intricacies of the Israeli-Palestinian situation, accompany us in this fateful voyage to a final and definitive peace agreement, one that would address all the issues that Oslo had defined as necessary for an end of conflict. Clinton's emotional attachment to Israel and his admiration for the late Yitzhak Rabin, whose assassination he took as the intimate loss of a father figure, consumed him with a sense of mission to accomplish the peace legacy of his fallen hero well into the very last days of his presidency. Eager to end his presidency in the kind of dramatic crescendo that a Palestinian peace would give him, he was even willing to divert his last drops of presidential power from the burning North Korean nuclear showdown to the Palestinian problem, which now became the central foreign policy endeavor of the prodigiously tenacious president. It was also evident to us that Arafat, just like Anwar Sadat in the late 1970s, saw his newfound working relations with Washington as a strategic asset. His friends in the old Soviet Union and Eastern Europe had all evaporated, and Vladimir Putin, who had just come to power in Russia, was still a long way from being the destabilizing, revisionist czar that he is today. It all now converged in a showdown between the right's view of the biblical lands of Judea and Samaria as articles of faith and a Rabin-style pragmatic approach to peacemaking. Alas, our peace enterprise was to be marked by a fatal misencounter between the outer limits of our capacity for compromise as Jews and Israelis and the Palestinians' expectations. History is made of such imperfect opportunities, which, if missed, end up throwing its desolate subjects into even deeper abysses. This book should be understood as an obituary to the two-state solution. The story of the Camp David process, and that of all the attempts at peacemaking that followed it, which are all reviewed and scrutinized in this book, needs to be seen as a defining failure of the entire peace paradigm based on the two-state concept. This rote religion that continues to dominate the international discourse on Palestine is dead and buried, and it is about time that all stakeholders shift their attention to other possible scenarios, some ominous and others less so, which are also examined in this book. Whatever solution happens in the future, it is not going to be the classic two-state solution with an orderly settlement of the refugee problem and arithmetically calculated land swaps. It would be a situation born out of chaos amid broad regional changes, the exact nature of which one cannot predict. Not all was bad news in this torturous story, however. The funereal historiography and poignant memoirs that have emerged in the wake of the Camp David process, where for the first time ever Israelis and Palestinians engaged in the Sisyphean task of dealing with all of the core issues of the conflict, should not overshadow its achievements, if only for the sake of the historical record. This is the story of a tortuous drama, which, as in almost all peace enterprises elsewhere, is always paved with crises and violence. Clinton's decision to convene the summit was not an irresponsible act of desperation of a lame-duck president. Palestinians and Israelis gave his team pre-summit ideas from which they believed a conceivable endgame could emerge. The president, moreover, as we could ascertain in meetings in Congress with his Republican nemeses, such as Senator John McCain, Senate Majority Leader Trent Lott, and a score of others in the House, enjoyed wide bipartisan support for his peace enterprise. The summit itself made enormous progress in breaking taboos no one before had ever dared touching, and it ended with an outline that became the foundation upon which the Clinton peace parameters were produced 6 months later. These parameters became eventually the litmus test of every serious peace proposal since then, all of which are scrutinized in Part 3 of this book. Against the unpromising background of the Oslo legacy of the expansion of settlements and terrorism, we succeeded in coming closer than ever to breaking the genetic code of the Israeli-Palestinian dispute. The two-state solution that was bequeathed by the Netanyahu government in a comatose state was given in these negotiations a living form and a precise set of peace parameters. But the two-state solution proved eventually to be undeliverable. It eluded us not only because of the shortcomings of leaders and negotiators, but because of the inherent intractability of the conflict. Ending the occupation, which friends and detractors keep clamoring for, remains, of course, a sublime objective. But this account of our voyage into the boundaries of the quest for peace, as well as the description of the peace process as it evolved in future years until the current impasse, offers a taste of how innocent can such a noble objective be. The Camp David story is not short of witnesses, Palestinians, Americans, and Israelis, who chronicled the process in informative and enlightening ways. The former Prime Minister Ehud Barak was the last to offer his account. His book is, however, essentially the story of his life and his exploits as a military man. The chapter that deals with the Camp David process is incomplete and disappointingly apologetic. The entire Taba experience is not even mentioned in his book, nor is the Taba story a first-hand account in the American memoirs, for it happened after the participants had left office. Clinton's and Barak's accounts are written from the heights of their leadership positions. They certainly are not self-critical analyses. History should not be what we choose to remember. Hence Henry David Thoreau's advice that "it takes two to speak the truth" is such an essential tool in historical research. My many flaws as a politician probably stemmed from my obsession with not abandoning my vocation as a student of history, or dare I say, as an intellectual as well. As such, I did my best to follow Albert Camus' adage on the role of the intellectual not being to excuse the violence of one side and condemn that of the other. This book pretends, therefore, to offer the most nonpartisan, comprehensive, and balanced account by an insider representing one of the parties. I have read all previous accounts and compared my notes with theirs, at times correcting my own original perceptions in order to offer the most accurate story possible. Evidently these were all instant accounts, written immediately after the collapse of the process. Mine is written with the advantage of historical perspective.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?